Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Almost Immortal History Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Powers. So what's this podcast all about, anyway? First, the easy part. As the title suggests, this is indeed a history podcast. It's a podcast for those who love history and for those who aren't sure if they love history. But really, it's a podcast for anyone who loves a good story, which hopefully is just about all of us. The podcast is born out of my own love of history. I was born and raised in the state of Virginia, near Washington, D.C., and had the benefit as a kid to visit so many important places and scenes from history, like the homes of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, Civil War battlefields, the settlement at Jamestown, colonial Williamsburg, the White House, and Capitol Hill, to name just a few. Rather than just read about these places and the people who inhabited them, I got to see them firsthand and experience them myself, what they looked like, what they felt like, and to hear tour guides or our teachers bring the people who lived there to life. As a result, it brought all of history to life for me. Thanks to my early experiences, now when I read or listen to history, I try to imagine what those scenes looked like and felt like, and what the people who make those stories were all about. If you can't physically visit places, the other way that history comes alive for so many of us is simple, through telling stories, great stories. If you think of history as a collection of just dates and quotes and rote memorization, it's no wonder you think you don't love history, because that's not history. I feel about history the way the incomparable writer and great storyteller David McCullough describes it. He says, history is about life, and it isn't just about politics, the military, and social issues. It's about music and poetry and drama and science and medicine and money and love. History ought to be a source of pleasure. It's an enlargement of the experience of being alive, just the way literature or art or music is. McCullough applies all of those principles into the books he writes, and it shows. To know history and the stories of fascinating people isn't just to have a better sense of the past. It's to better understand our present and our future. And in learning about it, you get to have a great time while doing it. Okay, so the second part of the title. What does almost immortal mean? No, this isn't a podcast about vampires or the undead. This podcast is dedicated to telling the stories of some of the most fascinating people who ever lived, but for some reason, their stories aren't as well known today. We have immortalized the likes of Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., Amelia Earhart, and Winston Churchill, and rightfully so. They were incredible people with fascinating stories. We should all understand who they were, what they went through, and how they shaped the world we live in today. But the fascinating and compelling stories don't begin and end with those amazing individuals. You don't have to have dozens of books written about you, or movies made, or monuments rendered, or your birthday observed for us to be awed or inspired by your example. Sometimes the most fascinating stories are the ones you've never heard of, or only knew their name, but not much about them. Think about that movie you watched and said, wow, what a great story. I can't believe I'm just learning about that now. So that's who and what this podcast is all about. These almost immortals. These great stories from history are all from all walks of life and in every generation. They were politicians, athletes, scientists, lawyers, military and business leaders, and so many more. The stories are endless, but they all have a common trait. They are all worth knowing and all a lot of fun to get to know. So that explains what the podcast is all about. Now, how about the when? One of the current rules in podcasting is that you're supposed to generate content to create a consistent daily, weekly, or monthly experience for the listener. Well, a monthly podcast is my ideal goal, but I'm not sure I can keep up at that clip. The researching, writing, and recording of each story on top of a full-time job and a family of 4 doesn't lend itself to quick turns or consistency. So I ask that you allow me to break this podcast rule and just enjoy the stories when and as they come. Also, this as I can turn them out delivery cycle makes it even more important that if you like what you hear, make sure you subscribe to the podcast to ensure you will always get a notification whenever a new episode is available. Plus, in the interest of your time, I want to try and keep the podcast to 30 minutes or less. So if the story goes longer, and they often will, I'll likely break it up into multiple podcasts and release them separately. So even if I can't promise when you're going to get them, I can promise I'm going to work as hard as I can to make sure I bring you a story that's worth your time. A story that's compelling, that's moving, that's memorable. A story that makes you laugh and makes you think. So here's to all of us who love a great story. Those stories always seem to be even more powerful when they are true stories about incredible people. It's hard for any of us not to consume those stories in movies, books, from family and friends, and yes, podcasts, and not have it impact you in some way. I'm hoping the Almost Immortal History Podcast will do that for you. And if you like what you hear, my ask is that you please go to our website, almostimmortal.com, where you can subscribe to the podcast and also follow us on Twitter at _Almost Immortal or on our Almost Immortal History Podcast Facebook and Instagram pages and leave us feedback. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Now on to the show.